Hello, welcome all of you to the Rouse Visiting Artist Lecture, supported by the Rouse Visiting Artist Fund at the GSD. First of all, a quick reminder about some features you see in this webinar. The speakers tonight will respond to audience questions towards the end of the program. Please feel free to submit questions into the queue at any time by using the Q+A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. We also have live captioning available for this event. Please click the live transcription button at the bottom of your window to turn them on. I would also like to give you a heads up about some upcoming GSD public programs. This Thursday, October 14th at 6:30, please join us for the Frederick Law Olmsted Lecture with the writer Jamaica Kincaid. And next Tuesday, October 19th, also at 6:30, the Harvard Indigenous Design Collective and the Department of Urban Planning and Design will host Jade Kakay, who will discuss the philosophy and recent projects of a studio, Matakohe Architecture and Urbanism. All lectures will happen on Zoom and require registration, and you can find more information about these events and others on the GSD website. So for tonight's event, I'm so happy to welcome artist Zoe Leonard and curator José Esparza Chong Cuy here with us. Zoe will present a work in progress titled El Rio to the River and will engage in conversation about the project with Jose. El Rio to the River is a large-scale photographic project centered on the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo River, in particularly the 1,200-mile section that demarcates the international boundary between Mexico and the United States. It is a work in progress that Zoe began in 2016. It engages us in a sustained observation of the water, the surrounding landscape, and built environment, including towns, cities, factories, and infrastructure projects such as dams, bridges, irrigation trenches, pipelines, fences, gates, border checkpoints, and detention facilities, built alongside, over, and through the riverbed. The project considers layered histories, complex relationships, and the interconnectedness of life on both sides of the watershed. And viewed from multiple vantage points, the river is considered as a natural feature, a water resource, a political border, as well as an inhabited region. A few notes on their biographies. Zoe is based in New York, is among one of the most critically acclaimed artists of a generation. Over more than 3 decades, she has produced work that balances conceptualism with a distinctly personal vision, which merges photography, sculpture, and installation. Her work explores themes such as gender and sexuality, loss and mourning, resiliency, migration, displacement, and the urban landscape. Using strategies of repetition, shifting perspectives, and multiple printing processes, her work often draws viewers into an awareness of the meanings behind otherwise familiar images of everyday objects, coupled with a rigorous attention to the politics and conditions of representation and display. In contrast to the speed and disposability of our image culture today, her photography invites the viewer to consider how we see in the act of looking itself, to contemplate the role that the medium plays in constructing history, and to consider the roots of contemporary photographic culture. Zoe has exhibited extensively since the late 1980s, including solo exhibitions at the Whitney Museum of American Art, Museum of Modern Art in New York, Chinati Foundation in Marfa, Texas, Camden Art Center in London, Pinakothek de Moderne in Munich, a photo museum in Winterthur, among many other places. Her publications include the titles Analog, Zoe Leonard Photographs, You See I'm Here After All, Available Light, and Survey. And then for Jose is the executive director and chief curator of Storefront for Art and Architecture in New York, where he introduced a curatorial framework named Building Cycles, which presents a year-long program of exhibitions and events that explores the notion of building as both place and process, laying the groundwork for new ways of making spaces and relationships with and within our surroundings, in some ways returning to the Storefront's initial focus on interdisciplinarity. Before his role at Storefront, Jose served as the Pamela Alper Associate Curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, where he co-organized a collection exhibition to celebrate the museum's 50th anniversary and curated solo shows of Mexico-based artist Tania Perez Cordova and Chicago-based artist Mika Horabuchi, as well as commissioned with the Costa Rican artist Federico Herrero. He also oversaw a solo exhibition of Brazilian artist Jonathan de Andrade and a large-scale retrospective of the life and work of Brazilian-Italian architect Lina Bobardi. Before the MCA Chicago, José was associate curator at the Museo Jumex in Mexico City and held positions as research fellow at the New Museum in New York and contributing editor at Domus magazine. In 2013, he was co-curator of the Lisbon Architecture Triennale titled Close, Closer. Thank you, Zoe and José, for joining us, and I will leave the floor to you.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Zoe.
Hi, José. Well, Mark, thank you so much for that introduction. And I wanted to thank everyone at the GSD for hosting us tonight. Ken Stewart, thank you so much for the initial invitation to join you here, and the entire team here who's been so wonderful in bringing this event together. Paige Johnson, Matt Smith, Kat Chavez, and a really special thank you to you, José, for agreeing to join me here today and to have a conversation together. The initial invitation was a lecture with a moderator, and when José and I started talking, it immediately blossomed into a conversation, and I think we had some really interesting preparatory conversations with each other over Zoom, even though we still haven't met in person. And I found all of your insights and contributions to be really inspiring. So I'm super happy to be here with you tonight, José.
Thank you so much, Zoe. And also thank you, Mark, for the kind introduction. And also I want to say thank you to Ken Stewart as well, Paige Johnston, Kat Chavez, Matthew Smith, and the GSD for this invitation, and for making this event happen. It goes without saying that it is a true honor to be in conversation with you tonight, Zoe. As a long admirer of your work, I've greatly enjoyed spending time seeing, thinking, but also reading about your work in a more focused manner. And as you said, initially the invitation to you was for a lecture that soon after we had a conversation, it kind of made sense to do it a little bit differently. But I have to say that I was first surprised by the pairing, as I'm sure you were maybe also too. But I would like to think that there's a lot of alignments in the way that you depict different environments, whether they are built or natural, with at least how I understand curatorial practice. And the way I see your work, there's an insistence in creating a space that provides the possibility for the viewer to inscribe personal meaning. And that's something that I find incredibly generous in caring about your work. And that's also how I understand my practice as a curator too, to try and create these spaces that are open for interpretation, but where the viewer can bring themselves into the picture and be in dialogue with these subjects.
Yeah.
So I find it that in your photographs, sculptures, and installations, you always allow for the subject to speak for itself. And personally, it's in these instances when I consider to learn the most. When I consider that I think the most creatively as well, by making associations freely, by being in direct communication and exchange with the subject itself, but also in dialogue with what I've heard you call the subjective truth. So it's Mark already made a brief introduction to your project, but so today you'll share a bit more about El Rio to the river, which is a project that you've been working since 2016, I believe, and that somehow began with trips to the Chinotic Foundation in Marfa, if I understand correctly, but also your understanding of that place and its interconnectedness with the region of that region with Mexico. So maybe we can begin with a brief introduction of like how this body of work came to be and how these visits and your understanding of that space made you curious about the body of water, but also the bodies of land that are on either sides of it.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jose. That's a great question. I started going to West Texas probably about 15 or 16 years ago, initially to visit the Chinati Foundation. And I found myself going back on repeat visits and eventually doing several projects with Chinati. And now I usually spend anywhere from, I live there part-time, maybe half the year. So I spent a lot of time in West Texas, and Marfa is actually only about 60 miles from the Rio Grande, which is the border, marks the boundary between Mexico and the US. So trips to Mexico are really frequent. You know, one crosses into Ojinaga really frequently. And when I first went to Marfa, I didn't realize that it's really a Mexican, or it's very much a Mexican town. There's a diversity of communities that sort of all have lived there for a really long time. There are Anglo rancher families that have been there for a long time, but there are also many Mexican and Mexican American families that have been there for hundreds of years. And Spanish is spoken in town by probably about 70 or 80% of the people who live there. So it was through Chinati and through the town of Marfa that I got to know that region of Texas and Mexico. But the longer I spent time there, the more complex of a place it revealed itself to be. And about 5 years ago, 5 years ago, 2016, I started photographing along the Rio Grande and conceived of a project where I would photograph along the river from Juarez, El Paso, 1,200 miles out to the Gulf of Mexico, following the line of the river. And initially it came out of this question of what does it mean when we ask a natural body of water to perform a political job or role. So I was interested in exploring some of those tensions and contradictions, and the different ways that the river had been represented or mythologized in American culture, how the kind of claims of identity around the river shifted depending on whether it was being seen as a landscape of the great American West. I say that very much in quotes, or whether it was seen as a site of a problem around immigration. So I started knowing that this would be a big and complicated kind of epic project, but I really had no idea how complex it would become. Over the 5 years that I've been taking pictures, the political and the politics of the region and gosh, how do I even begin to say this? The political situation, the river and the border have become a kind of incredibly intense topic of discussion and debate and conflict. So all of these things were unfolding simultaneously while I was shooting. And at the same time, I was also wrestling with a number of questions that I have as an artist about how one deals with representation, how one deals with bringing a camera to a place, what that means, what it means to be depicting a place, speaking, making an image of a place and a people and a time. So what my role was and how I moved. And honestly, the history of photography in that region is also really complex, and I think one could say problematic. How the places have been represented, how the people have been represented. So I found myself really wrestling with a number of conceptual and political and photographic problems, the ways in which photography intersects with the world, and how those images can be used to build ideas and create attitudes about things. So we have a lot to talk about. And the project, as Mark and Jose noted, is still in progress, but it's actually I'm in the really last the home stretch of printing, and the work will be shown in early next year. So we're kind of in the home stretch after these years. So without further ado, maybe I'll share some images. So I put together a PowerPoint, and it's going to run. I won't speak over it. I'm just going to run the slides. It's going to run for about 10 minutes, and there's no sound. And what else did I want to say about it? Oh yeah, you'll see occasionally there'll be a black slide, like a blank slide, and the screen will go black. Those are to indicate spaces between different sections. The work is organized in 3 major sections. There's a prologue, and then there's a middle section, which is quite large. It's about 500 photographs. We're not going to look at all of them today. It's a big project. The middle section is mostly black and white and pretty much dealing with documentary style photography. And then there's a short epilogue or coda. So the slides you'll see here today, it's not the whole project by any stretch, but I wanted to give you all an overview and a chance to get a sense of what the different themes are and the different ideas are. So it's about 10 minutes long, and we'll start it up now.
Thank you so much, Zoe. Thank you for sharing this beautiful work. As someone who grew up in a border city, I can really say that there's your work really somewhat captures in a respectful and sort of quiet way the complexities of these spaces. And of course, I guess that's also why I think this pairing makes the most sense. That you've been spending a lot of time in this region, and as someone from, I mean, I was quite surprised when we had a few conversations prior to this event. You asked me if I could share a bit of my own experience growing up in Mexicali, which is a city in Baja California in the north of Mexico. It borders with a small town called Calexico, which is in the state of California on the US side. And I'm gonna share my screen now so people can see. I only brought 3 images that depict Mexicali and Calexico that are by a Mexican photographer called Pablo Lopez Luz. On the top part of the image, you can see Mexicali, and on the lower part of the image, you can see Calexico. And there is that fence that you depicted in some of the images that runs across the border of the US and Mexico. So the more populated and the top part of the image is Mexicali again. These images are from 2015. But in our conversations prior to this event, I mentioned how, in my experience, the condition of living in this area had somewhat shaped my entire understanding of the built environment. The wall, or at the time it was just a fence, was so present that it was almost invisible in my day-to-day life, even though it determined absolutely everything. From banal things such as access to American brands, which were really sought out for her when I was growing up, to the possibility of even like watching a movie in the theaters as soon as it was released in the United States. This was, of course, at least 6 months before the release in Mexico. But it also allowed me to learn English like an American, which is something that that later made me feel quite uneasy. From pre-K to junior high, I went to school in the United States, but I lived in Mexico. This meant that I crossed the border every single day. I was actually born in a hospital in the US side of the border, in a small town called El Centro, and therefore was granted the privilege to cross freely across the border checkpoint. I grew up with 2 citizenships. This privilege of the 2 citizenships is what made this fence invisible, even though I was also the grandson of a Chinese immigrant in Mexico who arrived to the country at a time when the Chinese Exclusion Act had recently been enforced in the United States. For my grandfather, the border, which was fenceless at the time, was nothing but invisible. Quite the opposite, actually.
Right.
When this superstructure, as you described it in our previous conversations, determined the whole experience of my life. And in a way, this project you've worked on for the last 5 years unveils in a very poetic way these systems of power. As I grew up and gained consciousness, the superstructure was more and more evident. 9/11, for example, made it a lot more dominant and overpowering. Many things changed at the border immediately after 9/11. In fact, it was closed for, I believe, at least 24 hours the day of the event. by then, it was impossible to miss all the apparatus of the United States, from the border patrols, the surveillance apparatus, from the border patrols to the floating balloons with cameras and every other kind of like scene that's at the border. But maybe we can kind of like leave my border experience there for a bit and go back to your project. I think that in one of the, and I'll stop sharing my screen here. But in one of our conversations to prepare this talk, you mentioned you wanted to capture a social situation, which is a concept that stayed with me quite a bit. And as we were seeing the slideshow in silence just now, it really came through that it's not necessarily just an image or a series of images, but it's sort of the social dynamics of a space, of an area, of a geographic region. And I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about how you understood this concept of social situation, or if that was something that you went in sort of knowing that you wanted to do from the start.
That's such a great question. It's a big one. Well, going in or beginning to take these photographs, I could start by saying that the question of whether I would photograph people or not photograph people was a really big question. I didn't want to replicate a kind of 19th century attitude in photography to depict the landscape as completely empty of people, as if it were a territory that could be conquered, or as if it were a no man's land. The borderlands are inhabited, and they have been for many thousands of years, from long before Mexico was called Mexico or the United States even existed. So we're talking about, a region that's been inhabited by human beings for a very long time. Maybe the other thing that's important to say here, I guess, is that many people who live at a great distance from the border think of it or refer to it as one place. Oh, the border, like as if it's one place you go to and you stop your car and there's the border. And there are checkpoints and places where the border is very hard and very visible. But from where you grew up, in Baja and California, that's 2,000 miles of border all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. So you go through a couple of different deserts, a hill country, and then a lower delta that's almost tropical. So there's numerous different, climates and landscapes, but there are enormously different cultures as well. It's not a homogeneous place. And there are also varying degrees of a presence of a fence or a wall, and different levels of surveillance and activity, military activity on both sides. So it's a very heterogeneous, it's not one line and it's not one place. The parameters of this work, of this project for me, were really to use to move along the 1,200 miles where the river is used to demarcate the border. So I wasn't even working as far west as the region you were talking about. And I really don't know much about the Sonoran Desert at all. But I think certain things apply everywhere. And I'd like to talk more. I have a couple more questions for you later. But to get back to this question of the social situation. So I think there's this kind of question I had as an artist in terms of representation. Like, how was I going to photograph this place without, I didn't want to represent it as devoid of people. And at the same time, I wasn't inclined to make a portrait project, and how to photograph people in a place where surveillance is very prominent is, it's a complicated question. I don't want to replicate that surveillance. I don't want to watch people that don't want to be watched. I don't want to reveal people doing things that they don't want to have revealed. It is a border, and there's a lot of different kinds of activity happening all at once in different places. So I ended up arriving at a couple of different principles. In the early couple of years, I really basically avoided photographing people at all, because I didn't want to, I just wanted to let people be. And I had conversations with people, and, but I didn't want to engage that way or make people nervous or be imposing with my camera. But that presented this other problem where I was photographing like an empty landscape. Not that there weren't lots of other species and that the landscape doesn't have its own sovereignty, but that didn't feel completely honest to me either. So I ended up coming up with a number of different strategies or approaches or attitudes. And I basically settled on photographing people doing what they're doing at a certain distance where I wouldn't reveal their face, and no license plates, no license plate numbers, and no facial recognition. So I photographed, like there is a sequence early in the slideshow of people swimming just outside of Juarez, swimming right at the American, there's this a dam called the American Dam, and on the Mexican side there's a historical site called Casa Adobe, and it's a place where people go swimming. And so I wanted to show that there was this activity, and I ended up shooting it from a certain distance where you could read body language and you could read a kind of intimacy. You could tell from the body language, these aren't people trying to cross. These are not people that are doing anything surreptitious and they're returning to their cars. This is a day at the beach. So I was interested in, how do I say this? I'm interested in recognizing that there are multiple things happening all at the same time, that there are people living their lives in a very daily way, things like going to the beach, also hundreds of thousands, millions of people that cross back and forth every day in both directions to work or to go to school or to visit family, to do their grocery shopping, to go get medicine, to, in some places, there'll be two villages on either side of the river that are so closely bound that, like, you go to the post office on one, you go to the bakery on the other, you buy your vegetables, where it's really, there are certain cities and towns and villages that it's really one community, and the river goes through it. And as you pointed out, since 9/11, especially, the border has hardened and a lot of people's daily lives have been really disrupted. So when I think about it as a social situation, or when I came up with that kind of that construction, it was a process of recognizing and learning how to observe and depict a number of contradictory and interlocking things that are happening all the time. And I was trying to actually avoid or go beyond the kind of photographs that we're all really familiar with in the press, where it's like the place you can go to get the shot of people crossing or being arrested, or they're in the, in the headlights of a car, and they're, images that have a certain kind of drama to them and that are very predictable. Images that depict the border only as this kind of binary place where Mexicans are crossing and the US Border Patrol is stopping them. But that actually there's an enormous amount of commerce going back and forth. There are hundreds of thousands of trucks, millions of tons of cargo that move back and forth between the factories in Mexico and the companies that often own them on this side of the river. So there's the border is porous in some places and closed in others. And it's also people and goods don't always have the same status. You can have a railroad train where there are car chassis coming over, truckload, like railroad cars full of products made in Mexico are actively moving across the bridge. And under the bridge, you'll have a group of Border Patrol vehicles on sentry, making sure that no people are crossing. So all of these things are happening all at once. And I've found the more that I learn, the more that I'm frustrated by the level of dialogue around questions of border, nationality, immigration, human rights, commerce, and economy. I think all of these things need to be re-examined and reevaluated and understood as much more complex and interdependent phenomenon. And there's nothing simple about it. It's not a question of open border or closed border. As an artist and a photographer, I was really grappling with how to express some of that visually. I'm not a historian, I'm not a politician, I don't make policy. It was a question of observation and kind of close looking without expectation, kind of spending a lot of time in different places, going in with an idea, and then often that's not what would happen. Yeah, it's a long answer.
No, that was great. Thank you. You mentioned several times also when we were talking about this before, about your very specific intent of like positioning yourself as an artist while doing this project, not a journalist, not a different profession, or not like a simple observer, but like an artist, and that the project had an artistic intent. Whether it was clear at the time or not, that was something that you were always seemed to be very aware of. And I think it's quite connected to some of the concepts that I've heard you use or read about. Is this idea of like photographic seeing, or the terms of observation, and how that comes into play in that, but in the process of making this project. You mentioned also how you were very aware that you always had to show your camera during the process of film, doing this, and it was really fascinating to hear about these small details that you knew you had to do as you were moving around this area. It'd be great if you can share a little bit about this sort of awareness of yourself as an artist, but also how you almost had to reveal it to the other people that you were sharing the space with?
Mhm. Yeah. Um, hmm. Yeah. I mean, God, there's a few different answers to that. One thing I would say is that I'm really aware at a kind of a problematic in a certain kind of representation that can be really reductive. There can be a certain agenda within within journalism that is about expressing a certain idea, getting the picture that expresses a certain idea that's already formed. As I mentioned earlier, there's the kind of 19th century history of photography along the American West and in northern Mexico that really describe that area as a territory and a place to be exploited through extractive economies. So I didn't want to replicate any of the kinds of photographs that I had seen. And the only thing that separates my camera from all the other cameras that are there, from 19th century view cameras to surveillance cameras in a balloon or, set off by a sensor, the only thing that separates my camera is that I'm holding it. That's the only thing. I mean, I also use a pretty simple camera, but it's about my viewpoint, my subjectivity, my attention. I don't have training as a journalist. That became really clear to me during this project, that there are aspects of moving around in a heavily militarized area that I was not prepared for. And I didn't, had to learn a lot about how to move around a heavily militarized area where there's a lot of law enforcement and in areas that are considered sensitive and where there's, heavy surveillance, but also a lot of not only camera surveillance, where there's a lot of people that are surveilling. And I'd really never had, you're just never that far from law enforcement. You're around Border Patrol agents and various kinds of police kind of all the time. So early on, there were questions for me about access, like how was I going to get to the river? There are, in like Big Bend National Park, it's really easy. It's a national park. You can walk right up to the river. You can put a canoe in the river. It's super easy. But there's a lot of private land, and then there are a lot of and you can't trespass onto private land. And then there are a lot of areas where there are walls or fences or levees that are controlled by the Border Patrol, that where sometimes it's very clear how far you can go, and other times it's a bit of a gray area. There's also often a lot of military activity on the Mexican side. There can be narco trafficking activity. There are, people crossing. There is drug, people moving drugs across the border in different places. So my early questions about access, I didn't have I didn't have any credentials. Like, I'm not trained as a journalist. I don't work for a newspaper. I didn't have a press pass. And I also, in the early days, that seemed like a bit of a deficit, but over time, that became a real founding principle for me, that in fact, I didn't want to engage in any kind of embedding. I didn't want special access. I didn't try to get into any detention centers. I didn't try to get into any, around certain walls. I ended up finding my position as standing at the edge of what my citizenship would allow me, as close to the river as my citizenship would allow me. And sometimes that meant being very close, and sometimes that meant, being 3 miles away on a levee and hitting a wall and photographing a wall. But it became really important to me that my camera and my presence, that I was there as a person and a citizen, and I was working with my camera without any kind of special access or special protection. I'm fully aware that reading as an Anglo person gave me a lot of privilege in moving in these heavily surveilled areas that I would not have been able to do if I was read as somebody who was Mexican or Latin American. So it wasn't a kind of naive thing of thinking, oh, everyone is going to be seen or treated equally, but seeing how far I could go and how well I could move, crossing back and forth. I was always shooting from both sides. So I was crossing back and forth between Mexico and the US really, really frequently. And after about the first or second year, I was often joined by my collaborator, Tim Johnson. We did a number of trips together. So we were sort of figuring out and moving back and forth together. Although we didn't have press passes, then we weren't journalists. I think we were often read as such. It's like two people standing there. I'm wearing, gray and green, and I'm carrying a camera, and Tim is dressed in like brown and gray, and he's taking notes in a notebook. So we read as journalists. Sometimes, particularly in areas that are where there's a lot of narco activity, being read as a journalist isn't a super relaxing thing. So in certain places, because we knew we were being seen and read as journalists, we actually felt that we had to be really careful. And there weren't necessarily going to be conversations about, oh, no, I'm an artist. It's like you're there with a camera, you have a notebook, you're moving around in places sometimes where people really don't want pictures to be taken. Wow, I mean, I could talk about law enforcement for a really long time. But I'll say that very early in the project, I was trying to figure out my legal rights, like what I was allowed to photograph and what I'm not allowed to photograph on bridge crossings and on levees and dams. And I consulted with a lawyer to get like legal advice about like what I can do and what I can't do, and are they allowed to confiscate my camera, and sort of dealing with the U.S. Border Patrol and Immigration, ICE. And this lawyer was so fantastic. And he said a lot of things to me, and he did give me some legal advice, but ultimately he said, look, it's really not a legal question. The Border Patrol has full jurisdiction anywhere 100 miles inland from the border, and they run the show. And it's not, this really isn't a legal question. He said, this is a question about people how you present yourself as a person and how you, it's an interaction between people, and how can you move and keep yourself as safe as possible. And so I really early on, move really slowly, make eye contact, keep the camera out of the bag, hold it up, let people see what it is, signal and let people know that I see them, they see me. Most of the time when we were shooting, not everywhere, there were places where there really wasn't any visible border patrol, but most of the time, you're being watched, and you're being watched, and it's just better to acknowledge that. So we had to come up with a lot of strategies of kind of how to move safely. This lawyer had recommended that I contact the chief, the head of each sector, and ask for permission before I started working. And he's like, that's going to be your easiest bet. If you talk to the Border Patrol chiefs, the sector chief, and get permission, then you can move freely. And I just thought, well, if they say no, then the project's over before I even started. And I also didn't really want to go through that process. And I thought, let me just feel it out for a little while. And so I kind of learned how to move. I could go into a lot more detail about that, but it would take up the whole night. But yeah, it was kind of learning and then seeing kind of what worked and trying to get comfortable in these situations that were sometimes very, very uncomfortable. And then I just also want to say, there are places that felt really safe, and there are places that are incredibly beautiful, and there's sweet, lovely villages and incredible landscapes. And so it wasn't all tense. But over the course of the 4 years, I have to say, I saw a real change. The places that I probably know best that I made repeat visits were more in the western edge of West Texas and the Chihuahuan Desert, because that's just closer to where I live and spend time. But I saw regions that had previously never had any fence or wall whatsoever begin to build barriers. I saw doubling and tripling and quadrupling of the number of patrol people. We watched a number of different walls and fences go up. We came across construction and would sometimes seek that out. But it was clearly a very, dynamic and shifting situation that we had to keep adapting to.
There's certainly a narrative also in the way you order the photographs, and a big editing process, I'm sure, even though I believe there's 500 and over 500 photographs in total. But you chose to organize them in a certain way. And it'd be great to hear a bit about the process of the order of the slideshow, because it's quite telling of somewhat a story that you're sort of constructing through the organization of the images.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the piece, as I said, there's 3 main sections: the prologue, the epilogue, and the main body. And all of the kind of structured as a series of vignettes or small scenes, anywhere from, sometimes a single image, sometimes 2, sometimes 4 or 5, sometimes 10 or 12. And they will go in the exhibition as they go in the book, basically following the geography from Juarez, El Paso out to the Gulf of Mexico. So they're organized kind of moving downstream, moving in the direction that the water moves in. I didn't photograph them in order. The photography was done much more, when access was possible and when I could organize different trips, but they were edited to follow a kind of geographic order. And yeah, the editing process, which I'm sort of pretty much in the very, very last pieces of now. I'm still working a little bit on the coda. It was really a beast. I think I took somewhere around 35,000 photographs over the course of the 5 years. And I kind of had a sense of the scale I wanted it to have. It's an epic subject. It's a big and complex subject, and I knew it had to be of epic scale. But I also wanted to be able to have moments of intimate observation and to move between a number of these different themes, sometimes observing animals or natural or the movement of the water, at other times looking at the built environment, aspects of policing or road building or bridges or commerce, or looking at people's daily lives as they move around. Ranching in the western part of both the Chihuahuan Desert and on both sides, Mexico and the US, watching people work with cattle and watching animals in the landscape. So I wanted the structure of the piece to have a sense of kind of flexibility and the passage of time, and for it to read not as a monolith, but as a number of different scenes where your attention is drawn to a certain aspect and then kind of moves on. So there's a sense of movement from one place to the next to kind of keep going, like linger and move. But I actually wanted to also ask, because I know we're soon going to go to questions from the people viewing. And I wondered if you would talk a little bit, like you spoke so beautifully about growing up and where you grew up. But I wondered more specifically, this was something we talked a little bit about in one of our conversations, if you had any thoughts about how the built environment that you grew up around, growing up around a fence and all of this apparatus where the political constraints were made manifest through physical infrastructure, through an actual built environment. Do you think that affected or led you to the work that you do now that deals with architecture and city planning and sort of the design of the built environment? Like, do you feel like there's a connection there?
I certainly do. I think all my family is from the north of Mexico, and my grandmother was from Sonora. My father grew up in Monterrey. My grandfather was from China, but of course, this piece of architecture defined all of our lives. From my grandfather would have probably arrived in the United States had it not been for the Chinese Exclusion Act that was enforced at the time. Eventually settled in Mexico, and we all kind of grew up around that border. And it was interesting or at least for me, as I grew older and became more aware of how it changed everything, it certainly made me aware in a different way. I want to believe that I was aware in a different way of kind of like being able to cross freely across the two countries. My father was also an architect, and my sister actually is also an architect. So it certainly shaped my understanding of territory from an early age, and the concepts of nation states and the interconnectedness of two cities. So yes, it certainly informed the way I see and understand my work now as well.
Yeah.
It was really nice to hear how you described this subject as an epic subject as well, and maybe to connect it to perhaps other projects you've been involved with for several years, like long-term projects. I couldn't help but also think of, say, the Niagara Falls project, which is also of epic scale, both in terms of its geographic manifestation, but also in terms of the way you've installed it and the amount of images that you incorporate to tell that kind of story in a plural way. I wonder if you see any connections between those two projects. I mean, I understand that social and political implications are completely different, but in your approach to these kind of grand spaces.
I do think they're really connected. I mean, also, as it turns out, Niagara Falls is the boundary marker between US and Canada, so it's actually also a border. That piece, You See I Am Here, after all, it's all found images. It's all postcards, which were then, I mounted them on a wall in a way that sort of highlighted not just what they were looking at, but where they were taken from. So when the camera was below the falls, the pictures were, so it was a way of kind of replicating or thinking about mapping as subjective, and of recognizing that where you stand in relation to something determines what you see. That, yeah, we never see places in an objective way. It's where you stand is as much informs a lot of how you can understand something. And so that was a kind of like visual optical experiment in that kind of position. And it was, in a way, follows on this, very connected to this work, the idea of kind of taking apart or deconstructing a social construction of the place, like what Niagara Falls had stood for, been a symbol for, what it had represented over, several hundred years of human history with it, and how, and I wanted to sort of take that apart and separate our projections onto it from the body of water itself, that we read into places and we project onto places our ambitions, our desires, and we say that a place means this, but that's a meaning we assign to it. So one of the things I thought a lot about with El Rio is the idea that, or the fact that this river has been here way longer than any of us. It's, millennia old, and people came to live in that part of the world because of the river, because there was water, there was a source of water. And that the land and the water itself have their own sovereignty. So whenever I found myself getting really lost within all of these different kinds of social and political constructions, I would just remember, like, okay, go back to the river and try to find the river. At this point in time, the Rio Grande has been so overwhelmed with the demands human beings have made on it, the river, we use the water from the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo for irrigation throughout the Western US and throughout Northern Mexico in a way that has actually drained the river. And there are miles of the river that are completely dry for parts of the year because we draw too much water from it. So between the irrigation, the fences, the walls, the bridges, and the levees, and the dams, there are a number of significant dams on the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo. It is a very, very changed. It's a very changed body of water. You know, it's a very stressed body of water, to be honest. But to go back to your question, yes, I see a lot of connection with that. And also with a couple, I did a large scale project called Analog a number of years ago that also was around 400 photographs as one work. So there's something about these kinds of epic projects that allow for, there's one central subject with the Rio Grande project, as with these other two, a central subject that allows me to consider a number of different contemporary themes and sub-themes of major notes and minor notes. And with a big project, they're difficult. I mean, this has been such a beast in a way, but it also gives you a lot of room to move and to think about the interconnectedness of a lot of these things.
I'm actually looking at the Q&A, considering that we only have a few minutes left, but actually I think that two of the questions that are there you've somehow already answered. One is about sequence and the narrative in the sequence. And there's another from Marissa Futternick, who asks, how do you think about accumulation in your work, which you were just speaking slightly about. I don't know if you would want to add anything else to ideas about accumulation in your work.
Sure. Well, I often work with sequences or series of images. With this project, I'm thinking about them as passages. And I think something happens differently when you look at a single image of something versus when you look at 2 or 3 or 5 or 10. You compare, you notice movement. There can be a kind of cinematic effect or relationship. They allow for one to view a certain situation from more than one place, or to allow something to unfold over time. So I think what I'm going for isn't so much an accumulation of mass or more photographs just to have more photographs, but how, for instance, in that opening sequence of the slideshow that was a close-up of the surface of the water, and at first glance, they all look like the same picture. It's just, if you were to describe it, it would sound exactly the same. It's a kind of roiling motion of water, and it's opaque. You can't see through it. But each one is slightly different. So watching how the behavior of the surface of water keeps changing and altering over time allows for, I think, one to have associative thoughts about it, had to ask questions about it, to think about what's causing this movement. And it's a space for a longer kind of thinking. And I think, well, I know that I'm asking people to spend some time, not only with my work, but with this subject. I'm asking you to take your time and think about something complicated and give it the time and the space to not reduce it and say, oh, it's this one thing. It's it's this one image, but to recognize this as a really complicated situation.
Thank you. Mark Lee actually says, Zoe, I saw your beautiful show at MoCA and remembered how your early aerial photographs contrasted with the ones you shot at eye level, where your presence was felt in the photographs. And he asks if in your current project, if you were using a ladder in some instances or had a different sort of perspective, and if the border crossers were aware of your presence as well.
No, I didn't use a ladder. I was, well, sometimes I was in the back of the truck, but I think in this, I can see this question in the chat, and he's saying something about, I noticed the shots of border crossing were taken from an angle from above, similar to a surveillance camera where you're standing on a ladder. So I assume that, Mark, that you're referring to the last images, the ones that were at the very end of the presentation. And those are actually photographs taken of a surveillance feed. So there are these things called bridge cams, which are cameras placed at places of crossing, and you can go to a website and go to like the El Paso, the El Paso City Bridge, and you can click on these cameras. Ostensibly, these cameras are there to allow you to see how much traffic there is on the bridge at any time, so that you can judge how long your commute is going to take you. There are cameras like this at a number of crossings up and down the Rio Grande. And that suite of photographs at the end they're actually pictures that I took of my laptop while it was tuned into this bridge cam, watching people cross. So the people who are crossing know that they're being surveilled, but I think for many people, it's such a daily activity that they're probably not thinking about it. And in that sequence, when I exhibit it, I want to make it really clear that you're seeing it on my laptop, that I'm able to, that this is something you can actually publicly access. Like I could take you to the website right now and we could watch and see what's happening on the, El Paso del Norte Bridge right now. So there's something for me very dark and troublesome that I can tune in right now. There are like 8 or 10 different cameras that I could just tap into right now and see that feed. In the way that I photograph that surveillance feed, I'm trying to make it really clear that I'm watching a surveillance feed. That my camera, I'm kind of looking at the looking, rather than someone recently asked me if I would consider having the surveillance feed going in the gallery when I show the work, to bring in, video and movement and motion. And I thought about it for about 4 seconds, and I said, no, I don't want to extend the surveillance eye of a government camera into my show, but I do want to photograph this process of surveillance that is underway. The project, the artwork, the work ends with that sequence that I refer to it as an epilogue or a coda, because the black and white photographs kind of end with arriving at the Gulf of Mexico and going into the ocean. And it's kind of a really beautiful, romantic ending. And something about that didn't feel sufficient. I think that something really important that I've learned and I've been thinking a lot about is that what happens at the border doesn't stay at the border. The way that we behave, the way that our government behaves at the border is a marker of how it will behave everywhere else in the country. The rights that we give up at the border are implicated everywhere else. The attitudes and the policies that we agree to infiltrate our entire society. So I see these photographs of this, supposedly innocuous bridge cam as a way of thinking about the meta space, that how this place and how this sort of complicated situation of the border is with us, in fact, everywhere. And that we also, that kind of photography is with us everywhere. Surveillance is a part of everyday life in much of the world. And the way that we relate to the screen and just images on screen is a huge part of our life. The way that we kind of like look at things on our computers and on our phones. I think it's a whole new way of looking at the world and being in the world. And so I also didn't want the project to feel, I didn't want this work to feel completely in the past. I didn't want to shoot all of it in analog. So I took those photos of my laptop on my cell phone. I wanted there to be something that had to do with how we really look at images every day right now, and how we're kind of swimming through all these images and becoming fluent in a different kind of image making and image reading. But yeah, I love that question about the difference between the aerial view and the eye level view. And I actually also made a real decision to not do like a small plane flyover. I didn't want to get an aerial view. And they're very distinct actually from the photographs you showed, Jose, that were aerial views that kind of showed the landscape and the difference of the landscape on the two sides of the river. I wanted these photographs to be taken from places that I could get to with my own 2 feet. I wanted them all to have this like grounded, handheld attitude. And I think that comes across. I think you can feel most of the time that it's handheld, and it's very different, that last sequence that is photographed off the laptop. It's such a different kind of photograph because, yeah, the surveillance camera is like up here.
I was trying to formulate a question at some point also about your aerial shots and how different this was, and there was these images that I love by you of the panorama, the New York panorama, that are both aerial but also kind of like on your 2 feet. I think that we're past time, but just going back to the feed of the surveillance feed. I mean, it is also, I'm quite familiar with that, as my family is still in Mexicali and it goes back and forth quite frequently. But it's also kind of like a tool, an everyday tool for people that live in the border to know when there's like a long line to cross the border or not. So like it's what people use if they want to go to the groceries on the other side of the border. And you can get a sense if there's like, it's like a 30-minute wait, or it's like a 2.5-hour wait. But when these surveillance objects or apparatuses become so quotidian that they almost stop being that, or for certain people stop being that. Something that I find quite interesting in you resisting to use it just as a document itself, but rather do a photo of the feed on your laptop.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because what you're saying about how people use it, because there are many crossings where you can go to this website and it'll just say it's a 10-minute wait, or it's a 5-minute wait, or it's a 20-minute wait. So I'm curious about why in some places it's actually a camera, and in other places it tells you how long the wait is. And I think it has a certain use, but there's also something like in my studio, I used to always listen to NPR, and now I basically just watch, like, as the background in my studio, I'm just kind of like watching, I just have the feed on. There's a couple of crossings that I used to watch, and now I pretty much just watch this one El Paso Juarez crossing. And I both understand the innocuousness of it and the kind of practical daily thing, like when you're watching, kids going to school, and there are times of day where, it's really fast to cross, and there are times of day when people are standing there waiting, and it's really, really, really slow. But I have real questions also about what it means for someone, anyone, anywhere, to be able to go and watch people in that way, and watch who's crossing and who's there. And there's something disturbing to me about that also. And it's really different than going to a website that says it's a 10-minute wait. Also see a lot of things like you see these days, a lot of Border Patrol escorting migrants back across the bridge in really large numbers. But I've noticed that the positions of a number of the cameras have changed recently or are broken. Like at the Del Rio crossing, the camera angle changed recently. So I don't know. To be continued.
To be continued. Well, thank you so much, Zoe, for sharing your work and your ideas behind this incredible project. Thank you also to Mark, Ken, and everybody at the GSD for hosting us this evening.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, Jose. Zoe. Thank you. See you soon.
Thank you so much. See you soon. Bye.
Bye.